Hello, this is Jennifer, and I am here with one of my really long videos that I like to refer to as an episode. So grab a cup of coffee, hot chocolate, a glass of wine, and sit back because I have a lot to share with you. I am mostly sharing tips for stenciling, ways to get better results, ways to make it easier, and more. However, I have lots of ideas to share, lots of cards, so I hope you'll sit back and enjoy. All right, let's get started with this example and some others like it. This is the Concord and Ninth Threads of Kindness product line. So there are the dies that you see on the left, the stamp set that you see in the middle, and the layering stencils here in my hand. These can all be used together or separately, which you'll see as we're creating. You may notice that the die has stitching holes. However, only one of my many examples includes stitching. You don't have to stitch with this die. There are other fun ways to use it, which I'll demonstrate. Now, this is also a great stamp set on its own because it has a lot of great kindness messages that can be used with other products you have. So let's do a bunch of stenciling with these layering stencils, and I'll show you a few different ways you can set up your stenciling. The first idea is to create a corner template. Just take 2 pieces of scrap cardstock and tape them together as I'm doing here. Then save this corner template to use over and over. I will take a piece of cardstock and put it right into that corner, and I'll also take my first stencil and put that right into the corner. I will create a hinge with that stencil and then tape it onto the corner template so that I can just lift up the stencil, put a different piece of cardstock under it, and ink. That way I can do multiples while I have it set up. So you can see the cardstock moves freely under there, but I'll put it right in the corner, tape it in place, and now we can start inking. I'm using an Altenew blending brush, a large one, just because it makes it faster to ink. The larger the blending brush, the faster you'll ink. You can use any type of ink here. I'm using Hero Arts dye inks. I'll use a few Concord and Ninth inks later, but at the time I was filming this, my Concord and Ninth inks were at the spa getting re-inked. In other words, they were in the other room, so I started with the Hero inks. I now have a smaller blending brush and a darker green ink, and I'm adding some darker color kind of to the base of my stems. This is something that I recommend doing when you stencil. Creating that little bit of variation adds so much in the end and doesn't take much more time. Now that I'm done with that panel, I'll move in another piece of cardstock, put that in the corner, flip the stencil down, and repeat the process. Notice I still have a lot of ink on my stencil. Instead of letting that go to waste, I'll blend that in first, just taking my blending brush and moving it around to fill in the openings. Then I can pick up more ink and add it as needed. Now, you do not need multiple shades of green for this. You could just go light-handed with a green ink over the entire openings, then go heavier-handed towards the base of the stems to make them appear darker. I have 2 shades of the same color, so I might as well just use them. Now, once this is done, I lift the stencil, slide in a new piece of cardstock, flip down the stencil, and continue. So this little corner template is handy when you want to ink up more than one panel. However, it's also handy when you're doing layering stencils because you can be sure they line up each time. Next, I wanted to demonstrate the easiest way to ink on a die cut. So I have some die cut pieces using the dies that I showed you earlier. And when I want to ink on a die cut, I put it on a sticky mat, then lay the stencil on top. It's very easy to see through the stencil and line it up. Notice the stencil hangs over the edge of the die cut, which holds it onto that sticky mat, so both the stencil and the die cut stay in place. I'm inking this die cut up in the same way that I did before. So you have the option of die cutting first, then doing the stenciling. And that way you use the sticky mat. If you'd rather ink first with the stencils, then die cut, you use that corner template that I showed you before. I will show you some other methods throughout this video. So there you can see what it looks like when you ink up after you die cut. When you want to clean your stencil, what I find easiest is to just spray it with a bit of rubbing alcohol and wipe it off. This does a good job cleaning off that ink. Remember, I just used inks here though. If you use gels or paste, you'll want to wash it in the sink. All right, so now it's time to move on to the second stencil in this layering set. I taped it into the corner of my little corner template here, just like we did before. And then I put in my piece of cardstock in, to that same corner and tape it in place. Because we're using this corner with the stencil in our cardstock each time, I know it will line up. This is one of the reasons to use a corner template. Now, you don't have to use a template. You could just temporarily tape your stencil onto the corner of the cardstock each time, but I do find this is easier to do. This second layering stencil adds details to those leaves, so it goes on top of the green we've already done. So I have chosen a darker green to apply to all of it, and then an even darker green to put at the base of those stems. And look at that beautiful layering we get with very little effort. And I will continue to do this for all of our pieces. I really do feel like stenciling is one of the best things that you can do multiples of. While you have your inks out, your stencils all inky, you might as well make more than one. I will say I prefer to ink on my die cut piece as you see me doing here, because using that sticky mat is very handy. If you do not have a sticky mat, you could instead tape the die cut on the back of the stencil and go about it that way. All right, now it's time for the third layering stencil here. I put that in the corner. I put my cardstock right into the corner underneath it, and then I know it's going to line up. Over this stencil, I want to do different openings in different colors. Then it's handy to use a smaller blending brush. This will allow you to get into those little areas in different colors. I also decided this time to only use one color for this base layer and the next stencil. So this time I'm putting a lighter amount of ink down. One of the ways to make sure you put a lighter amount of an ink down is to knock off some of the excess ink on your brush onto something else. You can see there I have my lid upside down. Inside of the lid, I'm knocking off some of the ink before I bring the brush to my paper. Then I can pick up that extra ink and put it on my paper. This just allows you to have less ink on your brush when you bring it to the paper, giving lighter results. You can see it's really handy here with this red color. So you could also put that ink on your desk or on scrap paper, but by putting it into the ink lid, you have it there for later. All right, now it's time for the fourth and final stencil for this layering. This time I'm demonstrating with the Waffle Flower Stencil Mat. This is a great tool because it has that built-in corner. You can see it there on the top left. And it also cleans pretty easily. So I can just put my cardstock and my stencil in the corner each time and I know it will layer. So it's really kind of like the corner template we did later, but something that's more reusable and can be used for other things. I often use this a lot in videos. Now this is our last stencil and it lines up over what we did on the previous stencil. So I'm using the exact same colors of ink, but putting a heavier amount down. So this will appear darker, but it's actually the same ink pad that we used last time. So that's another tip for you. You don't need tons of inks to stencil. You can take one color, one ink pad, and do a light amount and a heavy amount. Okay, so I have a bunch of these stenciled pieces ready to go. Some of them have the holes cut in them, some of them don't. So I'll show you a few different ways you can use these products creatively as we turn these into different cards. For this first one, I did not use the die that cuts the little holes for stitching. Instead, I used that die to create my own stencil over which we can add ink to create those little dots on the flowers and leaves. To do this, I did use the outline to cut my stenciling. So you can see that piece here. I'm sticking it onto a sticky mat so we can do some inking or more inking on top. In my right hand here is scrap paper where I cut with that stitching die. So it just has a bunch of little holes. I'm lining up those little holes over the inking we've already done. It's pretty easy to look through the holes and see the color on our piece behind it. So basically, we're using that die to create our own stencil. It's just a stencil of little dots. Now over this, you could ink with a blending tool and ink, but instead I'm just using a marker to add color inside of those little dots. Now I used some freshly re-inked Copic markers here, which I shouldn't have done. I overfilled them. So the ink kind of bleeds into the holes, making my dots a little bit bigger, but that's okay, it'll work. You could instead use a smaller point marker or ink over those holes, and you end up with these fun little dots over our inked area. Let's finish this card up. For the background, I use one of my favorite all-time dies, and that is the Concord and Ninth double stripe card front die. It's a funny looking die, but this die allows you to do faux stitching both horizontally and vertically, or create a plaid. So I have a piece of cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I'm lining it up with the first position. I will then run this through my die cut machine as I would any die, and it'll create a faux stitching pattern along my cardstock. Now I will take that same panel and rotate it and line it up with the other area. Once I run that through my die cut machine, look at the fun background we get. So you can do stripes in one direction, the other direction, or both. Now that piece was cut from a light gray cardstock. I will add that onto a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. Now here is the completed card. I added our inked floral piece right to the center, and I added a black thanks die cut from the same die set. I also put a few little white pearls here and there in the floral pattern just for a bit of added dimension and shine. I think this is a fun way to use your dies creatively as a stencil to add even more to your card. By the way, the stamp set that goes with these dies and stencils has a larger flower that you can stamp. See those elements there? You could stamp that onto your matching envelope if you choose. I also wanted to say I'm sorry if my lighting is a little weird in this video. I had trouble with my camera on this day. I apologize for that. All right, this next card uses one of the die cuts that we stenciled on. So it does have those tiny little holes, but instead of stitching those holes, I'm just putting a silver glitter cardstock behind it, and that will show through the holes, adding lots of sparkle. But instead of wasting the center of that silver die cut, it'll be covered up. I'm cutting a little die cut shape from the center that I can save for later. I do my best to conserve those specialty cardstocks the best I can. Now on the back of my inked and die cut piece, I will put liquid adhesive. Then I will add that silver glitter die cut behind it. You want to give this some time to dry. It takes a little longer to dry on that glitter cardstock, but if you use a strong adhesive, it'll dry nicely. So I'll put something heavy on it to give it some time. I finished this card off screen, but it's very similar to the last one. I used that gray cardstock along with that faux stitch stripe die to create our background. Added that to a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I stamped a kind people sentiment at the center on that little label and matted it with silver glitter cardstock. All of that is from that die set and stamp set I showed you earlier. I also added some silver gemstones among the little flowers that really go nicely with that glitter cardstock peeking through those tiny little holes. So if you are not a fan of stitching with stitching dies, remember you could always put sparkly cardstock behind those holes and it looks just as good. This next card offers kind of a bonus technique for this video, and it's how to make an impression with a die. It's hard to see here, but I use that stitching die to make an impression of little circles onto our inked piece. So I have my Spellbinders die cut machine. You could use whatever die cut machine you have. And I'm first cutting out our inking using that outline die. So I'll run this through like I would any die, and there we have our piece cut. Now I'm taking the embossing mat that comes with my machine. Most die cut machines come with one of these. I then put my cardstock onto that embossing mat, then the die that cuts the little holes on top of that, then our final plate on top of that. This will impress or dry emboss those little holes for stitching into our background. And look at that. It just gives a fun little texture. Most die cut machines come with an embossing mat, and you just follow the instructions for making an impression with the die to get this look. For the sentiment on this card, I used the Concord and Ninth Bunch of Blossoms stamp set. This is a small set with a great price point and lots of wonderful sentiments in it, and they work nicely in the center of the stenciling that we've done. So I stamped that with black ink, and I also added some pearls onto our inking pattern there. And then I used that double stitched stripe die once again on the background behind that. Here you can see the little impressions we made with the die, and I also added pearls to some of those dots. It really looks great in real life. I wish you could see it better in the photos and video, but it's a great way to use your dies creatively. You can dry emboss or make an impression with any die using the embossing mat that comes with your machine. All right, now my final card example for this round of cards is one where I actually do the stitching. So this die is really kind of meant to do stitching among the flowers and leaves, and thankfully it doesn't take long because there aren't that many holes that are created. If you are looking to do some stitching on your cards, I recommend these Spellbinders DMC Floss collections. They have kind of collected the best colors and put them into different packets. They even have some metallic threads that you can use. I'll link to them below, but any type of DMC floss would work for this. A lot of us have it from previous hobbies. Now for this particular background, I recommend using 4 ply of the floss. Now this floss comes with 6 ply. I like to pull each thread out individually. And in this case, I'm pulling out 2 ply. I'll feed them through my needle and then fold it over. So when it's folded over, I'm actually stitching with 4 ply. So I'll feed this through my needle and then I'll fold it so that the ends meet. So there you can see how it becomes 4 ply. Now, if you've never stitched on cards before and you want to give it a try, I do have a video that is really helpful and I'll link it up here on the top right. I'm just going through this quickly in this video. So I like to tape my little ends on the back. There are many ways to do that. That's just what seems to work best for me. And then I start stitching. I go up one hole and down the next, up and down through those holes until I have stitched all of the pattern. So here you can see up one hole, down the next. There are many ways you can do back stitch, which is really what I'm doing here. I just do whatever seems easiest when I'm stitching at the time. So I do the leaves with green thread, and then I do the flowers with whatever inking I have underneath it. This particular one, again, doesn't take very long because there aren't that many holes. If you're looking for a beginning stitching on paper type of die, this is a pretty good option. But as I demonstrated with our previous cards, you do not have to stitch with this particular die. You can use it in many other ways. Once I've completed my stitching, I will glue that onto another solid white die cut of the same shape. That just kind of sandwiches everything together and gives the back side a nice clean look, because I plan to make this a shaped card. So I have another solid white die cut there. You can see it over on the right. This one we're going to do a score line along the top edge, which will create a hinge that allows this to be a card that opens and closes. So notice here I'm doing a score line that's about a 1/2 inch from that top edge of the card. It really doesn't matter if it's a little bit less or a little bit more. You just want to go right across the top of that. I will then fold along that score line back and forth a few times. We really don't need to fold here. We just want to create an easygoing hinge that will open and close nicely. Now I'll lay that die cut flat and put liquid adhesive above the score line. You want to use something very strong here. Double-sided tape would also work. I'm using Gina K Connect liquid adhesive, which is super strong. I put that above the score line and then lay our stitched panel right onto that. So that will create a card that opens and closes. Just give it a little bit of time to dry. I love making shaped cards, especially with products like this that will stand up nicely. Look how it stands up nicely on display. And it's nice and large, so there's plenty of room to write a personal message on the inside. I did add some pearls, once again, white pearls, and stamped a greeting on the center of that label and added it to the center of my card. I'll be honest, I love the look of this stitching on this because it really adds to that handmade feel. All right, now let's move on to a bunch of other cards and more ideas for stenciling, just making the most of your stenciling and getting the best results. For this next one, we'll stencil an entire background and then pop out some areas in the middle for a fun eclipse look. I have mentioned many times in videos that I love when companies come out with lots of products that work well together or separately, and this is an excellent example. This is the Concord and Ninth Whimsical Wings. First of all, there's a stamp set that you can use by itself, but there are coordinating dies that line up with it, and so do the layering stencils. Brilliantly, they came out with enamel dots in the shapes that fill in the openings on the stamped images. So instead of stamping in those openings or coloring them, you can put these little enamel dots. They will have a little dimension to it and fit nicely. I love that option. I don't use those today, but know that it does exist if you want a simple way to add color and dimension. Now, the die set in this little collection can be used in a few ways. There are outline dies to cut out the butterfly wings of this stamp set. There are also line up with the stenciling, which you'll see me do on this next example. And the die set includes faux stitching elements. So if you just want a butterfly of cardstock, you can use that faux stitching dies to add detail to the wings of the butterfly. I actually plan to buy this collection again and give it as a gift to my mother-in-law, along with some inks and other things. My new mother-in-law really is into card making, and this is a nice collection because you get a little bit of everything, and they can be used together or separately in really creative ways. If you're looking for something for your Christmas wish list, this would be a great option. Let's start out with these layering stencils for our first example. There are 3 stencils that layer together to form a butterfly, and you can use the dies with that if you want. Then there are 3 stencils that layer together to do the outside area of the butterfly. So you can use these in so many different ways, and I'll show you a few today. Let's first start with those layering stencils. I'm actually going to use all 6 together to cover an entire background. So I have the first stencil here lined up in the corner with a piece of cardstock. This time I'm using my Waffle Flower stencil mat because it has that corner, but you could use any of the methods that I showed you earlier. I will speed through this stenciling simply because I'm following a lot of what I did earlier in this video, where you use light and dark colors together. You leave your ink on your stencil so you can save it for the next project. I just want to keep this video a little bit shorter because it's already long enough as is. But you can see how easy these stencils layer up, and I'm just building up color. And again, I'm using smaller blending brushes to do multiple colors over one stencil, so different areas can be different colors. This is a great way to really increase the impact of your stencils. So there we have the butterfly itself. We could use the coordinating dies to cut this out and add it to a card. But I thought I'd go ahead and use the other 3 layering stencils, which will add the color and pattern around that butterfly. So we'll do it all together. Every time I'm putting my cardstock and my stencil into that same corner of the stencil mat, but you could use one of the methods I showed you earlier. I'm only doing one background right now, but I really wish I had done multiples while I had everything out because I ended up loving the result in the end. While I do this, I thought I'd mention that you really do not need a blending brush for every color of the rainbow. I recommend having one for maybe your pinks, reds, and oranges, one for yellow, one for greens, and one for blue and purple. And really, you don't need that many. If you just knock the excess ink off your brush by rubbing it on a dry cloth, you can use your brush for multiple colors. I know some people like to wash their brushes. I've never done it before. Now check that out. Look at that beautiful result we have. An entire background. I could leave this as a background. That's what's cool about these stencils. You could just have this as a background, or you can use the dies to cut the butterfly portion out. Now I am doing a little eclipse technique. So I'm starting with my frontmost die, which would be the body of the butterfly. I'm lining that up in the center and die cutting that out, putting a piece of tape there to hold it in place. I will then move on to the top butterfly wings. I'll line that up, tape it in place, and run it through my die cut machine. Each time I'm keeping the die cut pieces for later. And then finally, the bottom wings, we'll die cut those out. But before we glue all these pieces back together on our card, I want some dimension behind those die cut pieces so that we have that eclipse look. You'll see what I mean in a moment. First, I'll trim down my background to be smaller to go on a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch white note card. I'll glue that negative space directly onto the note card, and now we can start adding those pieces back in, but we'll put dimension behind them. I use those same 3 butterfly dies, the body, the upper wings, and the lower wings, and I cut them multiple times from white cardstock. I'll glue those extra white die cuts behind our inked die cut pieces. This will give it some dimension. If you prefer, you could just use foam tape behind them, but I think this gives much stronger results. It'll hold up better through the mail, and it gives better results when you're looking at the completed card. So here you'll see I'm gluing those white die cuts behind our inked one, putting 3 or 4 white die cuts behind each. Now we can glue those into the open negative space here of our card. I'll first start with the bottom wings. Remember, those are stacked up with additional die cuts behind it. Then I will add our upper wings, and then on top of that, we have the body. I'm using strong liquid adhesive once again to make sure that this all stays put, and I'll put something heavy on top of it while it dries. For a sentiment, I'm using the Concord and 9th Delicate Blossom stamp set, another small set with lots of great sentiments. I white heat embossed that on a black cardstock strip and added it right to the center of the card. So when you tilt this card, you can see that butterfly that's die cut and popped up, gives an eclipse look. Now, this is also something that you could just leave as a background with the stenciling alone and add something else to the front. I did trim that background down and added it to a honeysuckle note card that I created that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches. And I also added some pearls to the background for some added dimension and shine, but you could leave that off if you preferred. So there it shows how you can use stenciling along with die cutting for a fun eclipse look. Okay, next let's combine stenciling and stamping using the same line of products for a completely different look. Now in this case, I'm starting with a note card that is 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches, and I've put it onto a sticky mat. I then am laying over the top of that the stencils, the same ones we used on the last card. Now many stencils that are meant for layering have little tick marks in the corners that allow you to line them up over a 4 1/4 by 5.5 inch piece. I use those tick marks to line up the stencil over my note card. Then I will apply ink over it, and then I can move on to the next stencil. And with that, again, I will line up those tick marks in the corners. Oftentimes, once you've done the first layer though, it's very easy to line up the second layer of inking. I'm putting a light amount of ink here because this really isn't the focal point of my card, but rather just the background for it. My stamping in the center will be nice and bold. Now for this stencil, I have a darker color of ink, but I don't want it to go down super heavy. So I'm tapping the extra ink off of my brush onto the inside of the lid so I can use that later. It's a great way to get a lighter amount of ink from a darker color. You may have noticed that on this particular card, I'm mixing up my Hero Arts inks and my Concord and 9th inks. I feel like a lot of people have a tendency to only use inks from one company on a card, and there's absolutely no reason to do that. Just go by what colors you want. Here I wanted like a bright blue, so I chose Hero Arts. Before I wanted those greens and the aqua kind of color, and I used Concord and 9th. It really doesn't matter what inks you use, as long as you're happy with the color you get. All right, so now let's do the stamping inside of that opening instead of doing the other 3 stencils as we did on our last card. I'm lining up the upper butterfly wings, and look how brilliantly this stamps. I'm using Concord and 9th ink here. This one happens to not be re-inked yet, so I'll stamp this twice. I'm in the middle of re-inking all of those pads. Now this gives a great color that doesn't bleed. It'll stay nice and crisp, which is great because I plan to stamp in those open areas of the image in a moment. Now I'm stamping the bottom butterfly wings with that Hero Arts Summer Sky Blue. Again, I'm double stamping it just to make the color a bit darker and more crisp. And then finally, for the bottom of the wings, I'm using Concord and Ninth Aqua Sky, which is one of my absolute favorite colors. What I like about this is it's a lighter aqua color, but if you stamp it multiple times, it gets darker each time, but still stays crisp. So I stamped this a few times to make it darker and so that it would show up a bit better with my stamping. But notice I used the Aqua Sky for the stenciling in the background, and it's very soft. I then stamped the butterfly body with black ink, and now we can take those little filler images and add stamping to those open spots on our wings. I really like these type of stamp sets. They're not really layering stamp sets, but rather building stamp sets, because these images fit into the open areas instead of overlapping with what we've already done. So I've stamped the stems with Concord and Ninth Sprout ink, which is a great light green. And now I'm stamping in the flowers too. They easily line up with the stamping we've already done. I tend to stamp these filler images in a lighter color to go with the darker color that we've already stamped. All right, so once I have stamped this entire bold image in the center, notice how it stands out from the lighter stenciling that we've done around it. I added a sentiment to the center. That's all I added. It's the Altenew Versatile Greetings die set. You'll notice that I have already die cut and glued together lots of these because I like them so much. So I was able to quickly grab one of those and add it to our card. I cut the shadow for the word hugs from white cardstock and the word hugs itself from black cardstock. Now you could add more to this. You could add those enamel shapes to the butterfly wings. You could add pearls or little sequin dots or something to the background. But in this case, it's all perfectly smooth except for that sentiment added. By the way, here I'm holding up the card for Lila, who's across from me making her own cards. And of course now she wants to use these stencils and stamps too. Okay, so now let's do another card using that same line of products that has another feel to it. This time we did some soft stenciling in the background and then did solid die cuts in the center. This time I'm using the outline of the butterfly wings along with that centerpiece that does the faux stitching details. I'm taping those together and running them through my die cut machine with 2 different shades of aqua cardstock. I really love when die cuts offer that faux stitching look or a piercing pattern. It's beautiful in real life. Next, I thought I'd share another way to do your layering stencils, and that is to use your stamping tools such as the Misty. The Misty has a nice little corner to it, and in that corner you can put your cardstock and your stencils each time, and it'll line them up. Just like before, I used the corner of my stencil mat or that corner template that I made from scrap cardstock. The idea is that each time if you put your paper and stencils in that corner, they will line up great. So the Misty is another great option for it. Here's another idea for your stencils. After doing your inking, you can color in the openings with your Stardust glitter pen or any kind of glitter or shimmer pen. That will add extra shine to it. If you don't want to fill in all of the openings with the glitter, you can just trace the outline edge. Here I'm filling in these small areas with the glitter pen, so there's lots of sparkle. When I'm done, I'm adding those butterfly wings that I created before. I did die cut some additional solid die cuts to put behind it, so it had some added dimension. And then I die cut the body from silver glitter cardstock. For sentiment, I used the Concord and Ninth Friendly Florals die set. I really like this friend sentiment. It also has a shadow die to go with it. However, I only used the word friend for today. I cut that from black cardstock 3 times and glued the die cuts together and then added them across our butterfly. The reason I stacked those friend die cuts is so that it would be stronger when it's glued across all the dimension of the butterfly, and that additional dimension really stands out on the card. Now here I'm using a white gel pen to draw little lines and details on the leaves of the stenciling I've done. That's another way to step up your stenciling. Add white details to it. Here is the completed card. I did add a sentiment strip below the word friend that's white heat embossed on black cardstock. I also added some white pearls to the background just for a bit of dimension. The background is trimmed and added to a 4¼ by 5½ inch teal note card. This shows that you can trace in your stencil openings with a glitter pen to add shine. Although it's hard to see in the video, it really catches the light nicely in real life. All right, now it's time for our final card, and this one has some more stenciling ideas for you. This uses another great Concord and Ninth collection. There are stencils, there are dies, and there are stamp sets that all coordinate or could be used separately. I will say that one of the things that I really like most about Concord and Ninth die sets is that they coordinate with products, but they also include other dies that can be used separately, such as these little small butterflies that are great for accents. Now, this layering stencil set is brilliant because you can easily line up and layer 3 butterflies at a time right down the center of your card, which I'll demonstrate. And there's this super tiny stamp set with lots of fun greetings. Earlier, I mentioned that oftentimes layering stencils come with little tick marks that you can line up with the corner of your cardstock. Here's an example. You can kind of see them in the video. They're easier to see in real life. If you line up those corners with your A2 card panel, you'll know that they line up nicely. So here I have a folded white note card that's 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches. I lined it up with those tick marks and I taped it on the back of my stencil. I could have used a sticky mat, but I wanted to demonstrate another way to do this. Pieces of tape work great. So now I am inking up the first layer of the stencil, and it's the upper butterfly wings. Notice I'm putting a heavier amount of ink towards the center. I'll then lift my stencil off and move it to the next stencil, which lines up very easily. There are tick marks again, and this inks up the bottom wings of the butterfly. You could do a different color here. I chose to do the same with the darker amount of ink towards the center. Now we can line up the details for each of the wings. So I line up the first one, and I'm using a darker color or darker shade of the same color on each of the upper butterfly wings. Now for the next layer, which adds the detail to the bottom butterfly wings, I chose to use white pigment ink. I encourage you to try white pigment ink over color for stenciling. It makes it softer and gives beautiful results, something a little different. And I have a blending brush dedicated to just white pigment ink. Look at that beautiful detail. The last layer is the bodies of the butterflies, and I'll use Concord and Ninth mushroom ink over this. I love how these stencils line up very easily and put 3 butterflies down the center of your card. Now I went back to one of my layering stencils and I'm outlining part of the openings with a white gel pen. This is another thing you can do with your stencils. It just adds a little bit of a white outline. Now I didn't do it to all of the openings, just kind of the bottom portion of some of them on my upper wings. This makes it pop a little bit more, adds a little bit of a highlight. You could also do this with a black pen if you'd rather, or the silver glitter pen as I did earlier in this video. Off screen, I stamped the little sentiments between our butterflies. Those sentiments with the little curve that fit perfectly are from that Boho Butterflies small stamp set that I showed you a moment ago. For something a little bit different, I decided to make that white panel down the center flip up and the rest of the card be a solid panel. So I'm taking our note card and I'm trimming some off of the sides. I then took a 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inch piece of light gray cardstock and used that double stripe die that does the faux stitching that I showed you earlier. I glued that onto a solid piece of white cardstock that is 4 1/4 by 5 1/2 inches, just to give it some strength. Now I'm taking our note card that we trimmed narrow and putting that right in the center. So the way this card opens is that panel there in the middle flips up. Next to that panel, I'm running a bit of liquid adhesive and I'm putting in a thin strip of silver glitter cardstock. This is just from a scrap. Instead of throwing those little pieces away, I cut it thin and add it as little accents on my cards. I'll do this on both sides of that panel in the center, and it gives it a nice finished look, like I matted that piece in the center with silver glitter cardstock, but really I just used little scraps. I trimmed off the excess and there we have our completed card. So that center area is what flips open to reveal our personal message on the inside. I didn't add any accents to this. You could add any embellishments, you could add glitter if you want to, but I felt like I had enough with that layering inking that we did and the white highlights that we added with the gel pen and the white pigment ink that we added on the bottom wings. So there you have it, lots of tips for lining up your layering stencils and also little things you can do to add details to your stenciling. I hope this was helpful to you. If you're interested in the supplies I used, you can check my description below here on YouTube. I have links for you there. But remember, a lot of these ideas can be done with other stencils that you may already have. I'll also link to a couple other related videos here at the end. Thanks for watching. We'll see you soon.